People who accidentally ruin someone's life without meaning to. What happened? Story 1. A coworker went on a road trip to Seattle once. I jokingly asked him to bring back some powder. I wasn't a user and didn't actually want any. It was clearly a joke. On the day he was supposed to return, he called to say he was running late. I wasn't concerned when he didn't arrive at his scheduled time. An hour later, I called again. No answer. He didn't come in that night, but called the next day. He had been speeding excessively, trying to get to work, still in another state, and got pulled over. He had a small amount of grass in the car, which was a personal stash, but the real problem was a tiny amount of powder he was bringing back for me as a joke. That joke ruined his life. He had to move to that state, hoping to avoid a charge for transporting drugs across state lines. Because he had 2 different substances, they hit him with a dealing charge. He didn't end up in jail, but he served a long probation and had to live in a terrible place for years. I apologized and felt awful. He never once blamed me or held any animosity. He knew it was his choice and that he had messed up. Still, I couldn't shake the guilt. Before we continue, do us a quick favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I unknowingly introduced a close friend to the most toxic person I've ever met. My college buddy Chris and I both had a Thursday afternoon off and decided to go to a happy hour. It was early, and there were only about a dozen people in the bar, including us and a group of 3 girls. One of them was exactly Chris's type, but since he was shy, he didn't dare start a conversation. 30 minutes and a bit of liquid courage later, I took it upon myself to start chatting with the girls, and specifically introduced Chris to the tall, dark-haired one, Veronica. She and her friends were all single, our age, in a nursing program at a crosstown school, and seemed nice enough. Chris, I, and the girls ended up closing down the bar that night, and by 10 o'clock, Chris and Veronica were fully making out and acting like the rest of us didn't exist. I was happy for him, but grew a little uneasy when they left together, especially after her friends joked about him not knowing what he was in for. Still, he was an adult, and it wasn't my place to rain on his parade. After that night, Chris basically disappeared. The only times I saw him were in class or at that same bar with Veronica. He seemed off but refused to talk about it, insisting he was happy. Veronica, on the other hand, never let him out of her sight. She even made him wait outside the bathroom for her. As it turned out, Veronica was a complete sociopath, narcissist, and con artist who drained Chris both emotionally and financially. The lowlights included fake pregnancies, forcing him to cut off friends, demanding he drop classes to fit her schedule, and manipulating him into paying her rent, bills, and overall lifestyle. Chris came from a nice upper-middle-class family he was very close with, and they quickly grew suspicious of Veronica. I just assumed he was head over heels and ignoring the rest of us, but I knew something was wrong when his mom called to ask if I had spoken to him lately. It turned out he had drained his bank account and started piling up serious debt on the credit card he shared with his parents, spending on expensive jewelry, makeup, and clothes for Veronica. That was enough for his parents to drive 4 hours from their hometown to stage a small intervention. In the end, Chris had to drop out of school and move back home, and his parents got a restraining order against Veronica. They made him get a job to pay off the $3,000 of debt he had accrued, and he lost his partial football scholarship. I lost touch with him after he moved back, but I still wonder how his life might have turned out if we hadn't gone to happy hour at Kelly's that Thursday. Story 3. My coworker was always talking about how Jessica and I were going here, or Jesse and I did that, or Jess and I got up to something or other. One day, I ran into him and his wife in public. He introduced her only as my wife. Naturally, I said, "Oh, Jessica, it's nice to meet you. I've heard so much about you." As it turned out, his wife's name was not Jessica. I don't feel bad about it. He shouldn't have been cheating on his wife, but if he was going to, he shouldn't have spent years telling me about Jessica and then introduced his wife only as my wife. Story 4. A good friend of mine signed up for a beauty pageant during our university years. It started as a joke, but she passed all the selection rounds and advanced to the finals. A few days before the event, she received a call from a national TV station partnering with the pageant, asking if they could film at her dorm. At the time, her family was struggling financially, and she was self-funding her way through university, so she was living in a really run-down place. The TV station loved the story and wanted to focus entirely on how broke she was and the poor condition of her living space. This made my friend very uncomfortable. She didn't want to discuss her parents' divorce on national TV or show her shared toilet to the whole country. She asked our friend group for advice. Some girls strongly encouraged her to go ahead, seeing it as a great opportunity, but I strongly supported backing out, as I felt the station was trying to portray her in a pitiful and derogatory way. In the end, she took my advice and canceled the whole thing. The pageant went ahead, and another contestant won. My friend didn't place at all. She was a bit disappointed and complained about the organizers, but since she wasn't really a pageant girl, and it had all started as a joke, we soon forgot about it. A few days later, I had the TV on in the background while making breakfast, and it turned out the winner was more than willing to share all the details of her difficult childhood. I never really connected the dots before, but in that moment, it dawned on me that if I hadn't convinced my friend to cancel the TV shoot, she probably would have ended up winning the pageant. I don't think she ever saw the program, and we never really discussed it afterward, but I felt a deep guilt for quite some time. The winner went on to become a successful model and celebrity. While losing out on this didn't ruin my friend's life, she has a very successful career in her scientific field and is happily married. I still felt like I had taken a huge opportunity away from her. Story 5. Many years ago, I was heading to the track and asked a guy named Alan if he wanted to tag along. He was 17 and had never even seen a horse before. For each race, I'd tell him what I thought, and he'd either bet $2 or skip it. $2 was a big deal to him. Then, in one of the later races, a horse named Minya Mitzvah came up. Alan got excited. A Jewish horse. I have to bet on him. The horse was terrible, and I told him so. It went off at 30-1. It was early winter, and a heavy fog obscured the far side of the track. The race began, and the horses vanished into the mist. Even the announcer said, "Your guess is as good as mine." They stayed hidden for what felt like forever, and finally one horse appeared alone on the straightaway. We waited for the rest of the pack, which eventually emerged, but the lead horse was far ahead. Who knew what had happened in that fog? As the colors came into view, sure enough, it was Minya Mitzvah. It cruised home, and that's when Alan revealed he had bet $10. Suddenly, this kid had more money than he'd ever seen in his life, and his brain was doing cartwheels. He was hooked. From that day on, he became a degenerate gambler, always chasing that high. Years later, he admitted, "I can't stop. Even if you gave me $1 million, I'd be broke within a year." All because of a Jewish horse and me casually asking if he wanted to tag along. Story 6. My mom had married a man, and though they later divorced, he continued following her from city to city. I didn't know he was giving her a lot of money, but I did know he had physically attacked her in the past, so I didn't like him. She's an adult, and despite me voicing my concerns, she took no action to keep him away, and even allowed him to stay with her fairly often. One day, my youngest brother, who was 16 at the time, called me in a panic. He was really upset and told me that the man my mom was seeing had been staying with them and was berating them. My brother said he tried to stand up for her, and in response, the guy grabbed him by the shirt, lifted him off the ground, and shoved him into the refrigerator to yell in his face. Hearing the story, I was furious and shaken. My blood boiled. I spoke with my therapist, who urged me to report the incident to the police. I also talked to my other brother, who advised against it, knowing our mom wouldn't cooperate or press charges. I did it anyway. I wanted him to stay away from my mom and my younger brother. I was also furious with my mom for not defending him herself, for not reporting this man to the authorities. I called the police and reported the incident, and they went to the house. My mom wouldn't answer or cooperate, and the man returned to the neighboring city where he worked as a trucker. Later, we learned he had been cheating on her with a much younger worker. The police made a few more visits but still got no response. CPS eventually became involved because a child was in the home. Because this man was giving my mom a lot of money to cover her bills, she ended up losing the funds she needed to pay rent. Eventually, she spoke to the police and CPS. They checked my brother for bruises, which she later told me was humiliating for him. My mom and brother then packed up and left the state to live at a house my parents had bought years ago, one without water or power. They stayed there for months, essentially camping out. When they saw a bear on the property, they left, and the man followed them there. It was a grueling several months for both of them. Despite all this, the toxic man was still in the picture, inserting himself into their lives. At this point, I had effectively forced my mom and youngest brother out of the state, yet he remained a threat. Fortunately, my mom was approved for low-income housing. They moved in, my brother started college and built a group of friends, and my mom earned her real estate license and became active in the small-town community. They seem to have built good lives for themselves. That man still calls or occasionally tries to come around, but my mom no longer needs him and isn't as tolerant as she once was. My therapist would say that I saved them both, but I still feel a lot of guilt because things didn't turn out the way I imagined. At the very least, I'm grateful they are alive and living better lives now, but the man isn't in jail, and my mom and brother now live far away in another state. Sometimes I wonder how things might have gone if I had stayed out of it. At the same time, I wish my mom had called the authorities or cooperated. Then again, maybe nothing would have happened, and maybe he would have become even more dangerous. He's very unpredictable, so there's no way to know how far he might have gone if she had been the one to call the cops instead of me. Story 7. We were struggling to find someone qualified for a position. The job market was extremely competitive, and we just couldn't meet the salary requirements. Eventually, we had this one guy we were unsure about, but we needed help, so our boss decided to hire him. Essentially, he was pulled straight from the trenches and made a manager overnight. He was a nice enough guy, just a bit too gullible for some of the duties that really mattered, which caused a few issues. He had been in the job for a month or two, and the manager was already feeling serious buyer's remorse. Still, he was starting to win us over, and his mistakes weren't really consequential. They were usually pretty amusing. Every office needs people like that for morale, right? We definitely deserved him. So it's a Friday, and Columbus Day was the following Monday. He asks one of my coworkers if we get the day off. Now, we weren't a government office, Italian-owned, or anything that would make a reasonable person think we'd be closed for Columbus Day. In fact, it was a busy day. But my coworker, being clever, says, "Of course, it's Columbus Day. I'm pretty sure it's the law or something like that." There were easily a dozen ways he could have checked in 3 seconds whether we'd be open, but he decided to be clever. He came by my desk while I was in the middle of something and asked if I'd be here on Monday. I don't remember exactly what I said, something like, "No, I'm off," or "No, I'll be doing something else." I'm certain I didn't say Columbus Day or "We are closed." I ended up having to repeat this in several HR meetings afterward, while it was still fresh in my mind. I had taken the day off weeks in advance because the board I was on had the day off. Anyway, naturally, the guy doesn't show up on Monday. After about 15 minutes, my buddy starts laughing and lets it slip that he told him we had the day off. We start talking, trying to figure out if he's just late or actually bought it, and slowly realize that the 4 of us had accidentally gaslighted him into thinking he had the day off. About an hour later, Bossman comes around, wondering where he is. We had agreed beforehand to try to cover for him, but my buddy barely got 3 words into the story before bursting out laughing. We owned up to trying to keep him from getting in trouble, but it was just another example of how easily you could pull a fast one on this guy, once he made up his mind. Apparently, when the boss finally got hold of him on his cell before coming over, he asked where the guy was. Cheerfully, the guy replied, "I'm at the zoo with my kid. It's Columbus Day." Something about the way he said it snapped our usually cheerful boss. I never crossed paths with him again, and he hasn't popped up on my radar since. I'm sure he just changed careers or moved on, and I don't feel like I did anything wrong personally. I have to admit, I still find the whole situation hilarious. It did wonders for morale, though. Columbus Daying became a running joke we all had a ton of fun with, and whenever someone really messed up, you'd hear whispers about it being their Columbus Day. Story 8. I was in the military and became good friends with a couple, especially the wife. We would hang out all the time with our kids. At some point, they let a girl move in with them after she fell on hard times due to a divorce and had nowhere else to stay. The husband, the girl, and my husband all worked together on base. The husband and the girl seemed to be getting suspiciously close, but the wife often downplayed it or joked about it. She and her husband were going through a rough patch, and she just wanted to be happy. One holiday, we all had a 4-day weekend. Afterward, we were hanging out, and I noticed she was sunburned. She said she and the kids had gone to the beach. I was excited to hear that she and her husband had gone to the beach as a family over the 4-day weekend, instead of him staying home playing video games, only to hear her say, "4-day weekend?" He had lied to her, gotten up early, dressed for work, and was gone all day as if he were at the office. But in reality, he was on a date with the girl who had moved in. She realized this when she told me how the girl had gotten super dressed up and gone to the library. It turned out the husband and the girl had an all-day date, and he had told his wife it was only a 3-day weekend. A few months later, she found them downstairs on the couch, cuddled up, after he didn't come to bed at the end of the day. I guess it was bound to happen, but I like to think I was the reason she started noticing. Story 9. I work in human resources, and back when I was new and naive, I received a home address change request from an employee. I couldn't read the handwriting and wanted to be sure I entered it correctly, so I called their house. His wife answered, and when I asked about the new address, she said, "What the heck are you talking about?" A few days later, the employee came up to me and admitted, I hadn't told her I was moving out yet. Something similar happened to me at my hotel. A guest hadn't paid for his room, and a reminder letter had been ignored. In desperation, I Googled his name and city and found a number. I got the right person and his wife answered. She was very interested at first, asking questions, but by the end, I could hear her getting angry at her husband and telling me he would have to pay. That's when I realized he must have been having an affair or using the hotel for something he didn't want her to know about. Story 10. My good friend was scheduled for surgery when doctors discovered she had an aneurysm. I was with her and her family at the hospital, and just before she was taken in, she handed me her phone, asking me to keep it until she was in recovery. She passed away on the table. She had been a heavy smoker for more than 20 years, and the doctor couldn't find any viable tissue to graft. About 24 hours after her passing, when I turned her phone back on and handed it to her husband, we discovered she had been having an affair for years, embezzling money from the business to provide for her boyfriend, and had even signed over a car to him. It broke all of us, and I still have unresolved feelings toward her for putting me in that position. I think she knew I would find out and expected me to cover for her. Story 11. I was working for a federal program and had a boss who hired her sister without disclosing the relationship to higher-ups. She then paid her sister twice the usual rate for the job, and the sister was logging numerous hours she hadn't actually worked. I only found out because my boss insisted I handle the timesheet entries for her. When I had questions, my boss told me to take them up with her own boss and left for the day. I noticed the discrepancy immediately and went to the boss's boss to point out the issue with time tracking versus scheduling on her sister's timesheet, asking what I should do. The fact that it was her sister was news to the boss's boss, and the discrepancy triggered an investigation that uncovered widespread misuse of government funding. The boss lost her job, the FBI got involved, and she eventually faced massive fines and jail time. Knowing what I know now, I'd probably report her again, even accidentally. Story 12. I went to high school with a quiet kid named Jay, the type who sat at the back of the class, wore the same surplus military jacket every day, and had a greasy look, but a few times we talked, we had a lot in common. He was really into video games and nerd stuff just like me. I took him under my wing and introduced him to my friends. We played Dungeons & Dragons, PC games, and all sorts of stuff. I tried to include him in everything because before that, his only friends were his younger brother and a few other kids. My best friend and I were already smoking at the time, and Jay knew about it. One day, he asked to meet up after school to try it for the first time. I was excited. He was starting to break out of his shell, talking to people and smiling. So we met up and I popped his weed cherry after school. It went downhill rapidly after that. Jesse had an addictive personality. Within 6 months of trying, this quiet, reserved kid was ordering any research chemicals he could find online. This was before the Research Chemicals Act, so it was completely legal and easy to get. He started frying himself and acting erratically, even dropping out of school before the next year began. Keep in mind, he had really good grades before this, kept his head down, did well, and mostly went unnoticed. Then he moved on to harder ones, which I did try with him, though I wish I hadn't. I had no idea how far it would spiral. Before long, he was using crystal. One night, I was staying at his house with a buddy and woke up on the couch around 7 in the morning to find him and my friend standing over me, literally smoking out of a gas station pipe. I was probably breathing it in. When I asked what they were doing, they said they were about to clean the house. I was flabbergasted. I got up and drove myself home, dangerously tired. I barely made it without passing out, but I just could not stay there any longer. I stopped talking to him after that. The whole situation gave me a foreboding feeling I couldn't shake. Turns out I was right. He eventually started robbing convenience stores at gunpoint. He even had our other buddy act as his getaway driver. Somehow he never got caught, as far as I know. Later, it came out that he was into other disturbing things. He never got caught for that either. I was told he knew he might be in trouble, so he ran a magnet over every drive he had. A few people tried to take it to the police, but nothing ever went anywhere. He's been accused of abusing his nephews, but again, it never led anywhere. I washed my hands of him years ago. I know it's not exactly my fault that someone else would have introduced him to powder, or that I didn't steer him away from the wild path he took, but I still carry a sense of responsibility. Story 13. What I did was intentional, but I never realized it would spiral into something that ruined their life. I worked in a pub, and after we finished cleaning up, we'd sit and have a pint before heading home. Since the tills were all cashed up and locked, we would just put the money for the drinks in a cup with a list of what everyone had. Whoever opened up the next morning would ring the drinks through the till and deposit the money. I regularly opened it, and for several days in a row, the cup came up short. I asked the staff to make sure they were putting in the correct amount, and everyone swore they only drank what they paid for. Everyone was able to verify that they'd witnessed their coworker behaving properly. I decided to check the CCTV and discovered it was one of the cleaners, a woman who had worked there for about a decade, stealing money from the jar before anyone else arrived. Her sister also worked as a cleaner, and her daughter worked behind the bar. I had to report it to my manager, and she was let go. Since we had hired her through a cleaning company, they fired her for theft. Without other skills, she apparently couldn't find another job. A few months later, staff reported seeing her in town during the day with a black eye, stumbling around. Her family, who worked behind the bar, said she had gone completely off the rails, sniffing glue and drinking at all hours. Story 14. A friend once came to me to casually ask about another friend and how they were handling their new job. The friend with the new job was ecstatic. It was a huge opportunity in an oversaturated field, essentially their big break. I told the first friend that they were loving it and handling everything just fine. They asked if there was any stress, and I offhandedly mentioned some friction with a coworker, but assured them that it wasn't affecting how well they were doing. What I didn't know was that the friend asking the questions was also friends with the coworker. They used what I told them to help get my friend fired for creating a toxic work environment. It was petty, high school level drama, but it completely derailed my friend's career. Even 4 years later, they're still struggling to find meaningful employment. Story 15. We kept having boxes of parts go missing during shipments to customers and manufacturers, about $20,000 worth. As head of operations, I had to figure it out and keep things quiet since we weren't sure if an employee was involved. I placed a GPS tracker in a box and shipped it back and forth 5 times between 2 of our locations until I uncovered the scheme. It turned out to be a setup between one of our employees and a FedEx driver. HR terminated the employee and FedEx did the same with their driver. Our company chose not to pursue civil charges, and the DA declined to prosecute due to weak evidence. I didn't think much about it for about 2 years, until a coworker sent me a news article saying the former FedEx driver had passed away from an OD while homeless. I can't say for certain that my uncovering the theft directly caused it, but I'm sure it played a role in their downward spiral. Story 16. When I was a rebellious teenager, I left home and ended up living in a men's mission in Hawaii. I didn't have a license or a car, but I did have a love for surfing and a powder habit. I paid a friend of a friend about $50 to borrow a car, only to later get arrested for possession of a stolen vehicle and drug charges. I refused to say who I got the car from or how I got it. I wasn't about to snitch, but when my property was inventoried, the police found a slip of paper with a name, address, and phone number on it, along with a note that hilariously read, "Go incognito." I had written that note down because the friend said it when telling me about the guy I was borrowing the car from. In other words, the dude was crooked. Be safe and keep quiet. The police used that information to investigate him, discovered he had been running a chop shop, and he ended up in prison. Years later, I was clean, had my life together, and had even started working in law enforcement. At a funeral, I ran into him again. He came up to me and said he held no hard feelings, that he had found God in prison, and had turned his life around. It gave us both a bit of closure, and honestly, it felt good. Story 17. I was once the tool that stalled someone's career, though I don't feel entirely responsible. I was in therapy at an agency where 2 of my friends also worked as therapists. Around the same time, another close friend of mine had taken his life. At the funeral, one of the therapists I knew from that agency gossiped about private, confidential information they had snooped from his file. At my next therapy session, I was grieving deeply and furious about the gossip from my friend's file. My therapist pressed me to reveal who had said it, but I refused. 2 days later, I got a call from my second friend, an MSW therapist at the clinic. We hadn't spoken in over a year, so she had no idea what was going on. She asked why she was suddenly being questioned and possibly disciplined over the gossip. So I was forced into a position where I had to reveal who had been unprofessional. That marked the end of her career, and it was handled so discreetly that, to this day, she has no idea it was me who reported her. The incident happened back in 1990. I've often thought about telling her, but I believe it's best to leave it as it is. In the end, she brought it on herself. Story 18. My childhood best friend and I once made a silly plan to sneak out of my room at night. We tied bed sheets together to make a rope and lowered it out of my 3rd-floor bedroom window. She volunteered to go first, and once she was fully outside, dangling in the air, the knots came loose. I watched in slow motion as she fell all the way down, bounced off my water heater, and landed on the grass. I ran outside, bracing myself to find her unconscious, but to my shock, she was already on her feet, walking toward my front door as if nothing had happened. We swore ourselves to secrecy and never told anyone what happened. We were too embarrassed. For a while afterward, it became an inside joke between us. But over the years, we drifted apart, and now as adults, she has developed significant mental challenges she didn't have before. Memory issues, struggles with social skills, and overall executive functioning. I think about her often, and I can't help but wonder if falling out of my window all those years ago played a part in it. Story 19. I had a boss, and he was not a good one. He slept with employees, rarely came to work, and was a raging alcoholic. The classic good old boy type who couldn't understand why I excelled at my job given my personality. He was a made man though, kept around because of his connection to a high-level executive. Even so, he was on thin ice. At company events, he'd regularly get drunk and start fights or cause a scene. Still, for all his flaws, he did advocate for me from time to time. He eventually pissed me off, and when his boss came to town, I unloaded. I told him everything, that my boss was sleeping with employees, never showed up for work, and was drinking again. A week or 2 later, my boss was fired. His replacement came in, and while he wasn't much better, he sucked just a little less. I heard a couple of years ago that my old boss, the one I likely helped get fired, passed of liver disease at 43. Rumor was he had been begging to just be allowed to die. About a year later, the executive who always bailed him out also passed away, though I never learned the cause. Story 20. I was a volunteer firefighter some time ago when the pager went off for a medical assist. I gave my spot on the truck to the rookie in training. I figured that with a lift assist, he could help the team and get the mental boost of being actively involved. I shouldn't have done it. The patient was an older man who had been smoking in his wheelchair while wearing synthetic clothing and using oxygen through his nose. He caught fire. There was a lift assist to get him onto the helicopter, but he didn't survive the flight. The rookie had to witness that on his first call. He left the brigade shortly afterward. Some things you can never unsee. And he was just a high schooler trying to do something good for the community. I hope he's doing okay these days. I've seen a lot that will never leave me too, but I've come to accept that this is the way life and death can be. Once the helmet was on, I was prepared for whatever came my way. The kid, though, probably had his first real encounter with that reality, and he wasn't prepared. Story 21. 20 years ago, I worked as a computer tech at the university. One day, a colleague told me she was reviewing an intriguing master's thesis and asked if I could track down some authors cited in the references. Back then, much of the material wasn't online or easily searchable, so it took some digging. I followed obscure links and eventually found a copy of one of the referenced articles. To my surprise, the entire chapter was essentially just a single citation. The student had simply changed all the I's. For example, "I have researched" became "the author has researched." Of course, that's not how proper citation works. This all happened literally on the eve of the thesis defense. It caused a major scandal in the department. The student was expelled, but since they had formally completed their coursework, they couldn't simply repeat the year. They would have had to start over in a different department to earn the master's degree. Of course, it wasn't my fault. Still, being so instrumental in the downfall of someone's academic career left me with a strange, uneasy feeling. Story 22. I was a freshman in college and had just met a guy on Tinder. We smoked and hooked up. It was his first time smoking, which was no big deal. He kept wanting to smoke and even suggested trying shrooms together, which was also fine. Eventually, he got hold of some, had a bad trip, and completely changed. Honestly, it was creepy. He kept talking about how much he felt he knew now, and that he just wanted to help me learn. After that, he only talked about dropping out of college and joining the military. He did drop out, and I have no idea what happened to him after he went back home. I feel awful because I'm sure his family was confused when he came back acting like that. Now, I refuse to let my husband take shrooms with me, especially since he doesn't smoke or anything. I'm sure the guy is probably fine now since this happened 4 years ago, but I can't help thinking that if I hadn't offered to smoke, he might have continued his college education. More importantly, it was just unsettling to see such a reaction to shrooms, and I really can't say how he is today. Story 23. Years ago, I fired an employee for lying about work that hadn't been done. It was the last straw. I was done. After years of gaslighting, poor performance, and outright insubordination, I realized I had done everything I could to fix the situation, so I let them go. They ugly cried in my office and all the way down the hall while packing up their things. Later, it turned out they had sabotaged our VPN when HR stepped away to answer a call. They were immediately banned from the property. Years later, I learned this person was mildly diabetic and spent 4 years eating everything sweet they could find, gaining over 100 pounds before they passed away. I've fired others, and it's always a difficult thing to do, even when necessary. But this person truly believed they would never be held accountable for their actions, and honestly, I don't care. They were awful and hurtful, and the world is better off without them. Story 24. I was dating a guy on and off for a year. At one point, we had a pregnancy scare, and he offered to marry me to do things the right way. That's when I realized I didn't want someone to offer to marry me. I wanted them to want to. He was nice, attractive, financially secure, and generally a good person. The pregnancy ended prematurely, which made him sad, and I think it brought him closer to me. He was quite a bit older, and I realized I didn't want to be with him. Still, he was great in bed, and I struggled to end the relationship. To complicate matters, we lived in a 3-flat. He and a friend rented the 3rd floor, and I rented the 2nd. Conveniently, a good hookup is hard to say no to. I won't sugarcoat it. I very much led him on. I would knock on his bedroom window from the porch whenever I wanted to sleep with him. To be honest, we didn't talk much, and the number of times we went out or actually did anything together was tiny compared to the time we dated after the pregnancy scare. Towards the end, I made it clear we weren't headed anywhere long-term, but I think he thought I was playing hard to get. One day I met a guy on MySpace, and over a single weekend we fell in love and got engaged. I broke things off with the other guy before anything happened, but because of our housing setup, he had to walk past me and my new fiancé every day on his way up the stairs to his apartment. Apparently, I meant more to him than I realized. He thought I was playing hard to get, and that we would eventually get married. When his lease ran out, he quit his job and moved across the country to live with his mom and mend his heart. I've been married for 20 years now to the MySpace guy. We have a wonderful life, better than I could have ever imagined. But I still feel guilty that this successful, kind, and attractive man uprooted his entire life, at least in part, because I hurt him. Story 25. I suspected my uncle had Alzheimer's 7 or 8 years before he was officially diagnosed, but I didn't do anything about it. He was only 61 when the diagnosis came. By that time, the disease had progressed too far to do much. Treatments can slow it slightly, but the earlier it's caught, the more effective they are. My grandmother on the same side also had Alzheimer's. It was rough and traumatizing for my mom and her siblings. As I entered adulthood, I began researching the illness. My grandmother passed away when I was 20. Only 2 years later, I was helping my uncle with his phone and began noticing some telltale signs of early-onset Alzheimer's. He had never been great with technology, but now he seemed to forget things we had just done and struggled to follow basic instructions. He had spent most of his life working around heavy machinery without ear protection and already had significant hearing loss. He lived alone, and I knew all of these were risk factors. The next day, I brought it up with my family. They tore into me, dismissing it as him just being bad with technology. They berated me for being an overdramatic alarmist and upsetting everyone. I immediately caved. I felt terrible and assumed I had been mistaken, reading too much into things. In reality, I felt awful and never brought it up again. 7 years later, I was right. He was diagnosed, and by then the disease had progressed so far that he had likely been living with Alzheimer's for years. If I had trusted myself, he might have had an early intervention and enjoyed many more healthy years. He would probably be relatively well now, but instead, he is a shadow of his former self. Huge parts of who he was are already gone, and I let it happen. No one in my family seems to remember the dinner when I brought it up all those years ago. My sister even rolls her eyes and tells me to stop. My mom says she remembers me mentioning it but doesn't recall anyone dismissing me and insists I must not have been that sure, or they would have listened. I am much more confident in myself now. Story 26. My college boyfriend and I had a terrible relationship during freshman year. He constantly yelled at me and was mean. For example, on Valentine's Day, he told me he was going to a party with friends, so I decided to have dinner with my girlfriend and my best friend's boyfriend at one of the dining halls. He ran into us, physically yanked me to a doorway just 2 feet away, and yelled at me, calling me names for hanging out with a man who supposedly had a thing for me or stupid for not realizing it. For the record, that man had no interest in me. This was 13 years ago, and he is still with that friend. Anyway, the relationship was bad, and I didn't handle our breakup well at the end of freshman year. Neither did he. He started dating someone new, but we continued to interact and, of course, argue and fight. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. The fighting had gotten out of hand, and it wasn't entirely his fault. I was out of line just as much, if not more. I had a breakdown and went to the university police. They granted a restraining order and required both of us to meet separately with the university standards office. I'm not exactly sure what happened on his end, but his girlfriend found out he was still talking to me and flipped out. I believe the university ordered him to see a psychologist who diagnosed him with bipolar disorder. He then attempted self-harm but thankfully survived. He had been on track for medical school, but that never happened, and I assume this was part of the reason. He reached out 2 years ago and asked me to marry him. We caught up a little. He's doing better, though not fully well. I feel guilty, always have. I've often felt that I should have had stronger character, not been so easily triggered, and not been so quick to argue with him. I wish I hadn't had a breakdown or gone to the police. I recognize that I'm only human and was dealing with someone undiagnosed and suffering from bipolar disorder, which changes the context, but still, I wish I had handled things better. I think many others would have. I'm glad he was diagnosed and received treatment, but I wish it hadn't been our fighting, much of which I started, that led him there. Story 27. Our old landlord kept increasing the rent, so we were eventually forced to leave his flat. He tried to use loopholes to make us pay for several months and refused the increased deposit. We have a strong, fair law that requires landlords to return a proportionally larger deposit if they raise the rent, but he didn't know this, so he owed us a significant amount. Eventually, he gave up, provided a paper confirming the flat was left in good condition, and went no contact with both us and the next tenant we found. He also owed her some money, as she had already moved in and started work in the flat. We were sure he had tricked us and gone no contact to avoid returning our money. After a few months of being frustrated with him, we decided to contact a lawyer. But during further research on his address, we discovered, sadly, that the old man had passed away before the date he was supposed to pay our deposit back. We checked his social media and saw many friends grieving him, but no sign of close family. Instead, we found a woman he had mentioned several times who had likely scammed him by claiming she needed money for her sick mother. He was an older man, but generally healthy and active. There's a good chance he deteriorated, or at least developed psychosomatic health issues like a heart attack after losing his regular monthly income once we left. I don't feel guilty about it, but I do feel very sad. It takes me some time to stop hating him after realizing that he hadn't actually scammed us or stolen our deposit. Story 28. I used to work with a guy who was an addict and alcoholic, and he smoked constantly. He couldn't have a driver's license because he had accumulated too many DUIs. He used to hang out with me and my coworkers at the bar, until one day he told us he had a girlfriend and then took the bartender home. After that, we stopped inviting him out. He used to call me on our days off to complain about his life, never letting me get a word in. Once he said he would shoot his shot, but that I was too old for him. I laughed in his face and hung up. He called 10 more times until I finally answered, and the rants continued. After that, I blocked his number. He tried pursuing the 20-year-old women at our job and succeeded with one, but both incidents triggered major HR investigations. He was still with his girlfriend when he went after the second woman. He often showed up to work drunk or high, and we didn't really know how to handle it, so it went on for far too long. A few weeks ago, he came in visibly confused and angry, and we all knew it would be the last time. He denied taking a drug test, so they sent him home, deactivating his badge before he even left the building. While waiting for his Uber, he tried to guilt-trip my supervisor. I have no idea where this guy ended up, and I don't really care. He could be fun to hang out with, but he was a terrible person. He constantly threatened to harm himself. I hope he didn't, but we'll never know, and I have no desire to find out. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.